Evelyn Matthews stood in her modest kitchen, the early morning light streaming through the small window, casting a golden glow over the worn countertops. The room was quiet except for the sound of her steady breathing, which quickened as her eyes scanned the crisp envelope in her trembling hands. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. The Harvard University seal glinted in the light, and she felt her heart race as she contemplated the significance of this moment. Evelyn had waited for what felt like a lifetime for this. 60 long years of dreams deferred, sacrifices made, and a will to persevere despite the odds. Her fingers fumbled as she carefully opened the envelope, not wanting to tear the delicate paper that held her future. As she unfolded the letter, her eyes filled with tears before she even began reading. The first line alone was enough to send her reeling. We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Harvard Medical School class of 2024. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry of disbelief and joy. She sank into the nearest chair, the letter clutched to her chest, as years of emotion welled up inside her. Memories flooded her mind, taking her back to her childhood in the south side of Chicago during the early 1960s. Life had not been easy, but even as a young girl, Evelyn had dreamed of becoming a doctor. Her father, Henry Matthews, was a janitor who worked tirelessly to support his family, and her mother, Louise, was a homemaker who took on extra jobs cleaning houses to make ends meet. They lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where the schools were underfunded and opportunities were scarce. Evelyn's father had been her hero. Despite his exhaustion, he always made time to sit with her at the kitchen table after dinner, helping her with her homework and encouraging her dreams. You can be anything you want, baby girl, he would say, his voice filled with pride and hope. The world might try to tell you otherwise, but don't you let it. You got a mind as sharp as a tack, and that's all you need to get where you're going. But the world did have its way of trying to tell her otherwise. As Evelyn grew older, she witnessed the harsh realities of life in her community. Her father, who had always been her pillar of strength, began to suffer from severe hypertension, a condition that was all too common among the men in their neighborhood. He worked long hours, and the physical toll on his body was evident. The local clinic, often overcrowded and under-resourced, provided little in the way of proper care. Evelyn watched helplessly as her father's health deteriorated. He passed away when she was just 12 years old, leaving a void that nothing could fill. Henry Matthews' death was a turning point for Evelyn. It ignited a fire within her, a burning desire to understand the human body and to one day provide the kind of care that her father had been denied. But with his passing, the burden of responsibility fell heavily on her young shoulders. Her mother, now the sole breadwinner, struggled to keep the family afloat. Evelyn, the eldest of 4 siblings, was forced to step into the role of caregiver, helping to raise her brothers and sisters while trying to keep her own dreams alive. Throughout her teenage years, Evelyn excelled in school, particularly in science and mathematics. Her teachers recognized her potential and encouraged her to pursue higher education. However, the reality of her family's financial situation meant that college seemed like an unattainable goal. The idea of becoming a doctor felt like a distant fantasy, something meant for other people, those who had the resources and support that she lacked. After graduating from high school, Evelyn took on multiple jobs to help her mother, working as a waitress during the day and as a nurse's aide at night. The latter job, though grueling, brought her a sense of fulfillment. She cared for elderly patients, many of whom reminded her of her father. In them, she saw the same vulnerabilities and the same need for compassionate care. The medical staff at the clinic took note of her dedication and encouraged her to consider a career in nursing. But Evelyn's heart was set on something more. She wanted to be a doctor, to be the person who made the critical decisions that could save lives. Years passed, and Evelyn's dream was buried under the weight of responsibility and societal expectations. She married Charles, a man she met while working at the clinic, and together they had 2 children, Jessica and Malcolm. Charles was a good man, but his own dreams had been crushed by the relentless grind of life in their neighborhood. He worked as a mechanic, often pulling double shifts to provide for the family. As much as he loved Evelyn, He could not understand her desire to pursue a career in medicine, especially at her age. "Evie, you're 55 years old," he would say, his voice tinged with concern and frustration. "Don't you think it's time to let that dream go? We got kids to worry about and bills to pay. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." But it wasn't about proving anything to anyone, Evelyn thought. It was about fulfilling a promise she had made to herself so many years ago, standing at her father's grave, vowing that she would find a way to make a difference in the world. Despite the doubts and the discouragement from those around her, Evelyn never let go of that promise. She continued to work as a nurse's aide, finding solace in the small ways she could help her patients. But the longing to do more gnawed at her, refusing to be silenced. It wasn't until her children were grown, and Charles had passed away from a heart attack, another victim of the same systemic neglect that had claimed her father, that Evelyn decided it was time to act. She began taking classes at a local community college, determined to complete the prerequisites needed for medical school. Her friends thought she was crazy, and her children were worried, but Evelyn pressed on, driven by a force stronger than reason. As she sat in her kitchen, clutching the acceptance letter from Harvard, Evelyn knew that her journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The challenges ahead would be daunting, but she had faced worse in her life. The little girl who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor had grown into a woman who was ready to make that dream a reality. With tears streaming down her face, Evelyn whispered to herself, "I did it, Daddy. I'm going to be a doctor." The road to this moment had been long and arduous, filled with loss, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. But Evelyn Matthews had proven that even in the face of insurmountable odds, a dream deferred was not a dream denied. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope, and stood up, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. There was still so much to do, so much to learn, and so many people to help. But for now, she allowed herself to savor this victory, knowing that it was only the beginning of something extraordinary. The sun was setting over the south side of Chicago, casting long shadows over the streets that Evelyn Matthews had walked for so many years. The neighborhood had changed in some ways, but in many others it remained the same. A place where dreams were often deferred, if not crushed altogether. But Evelyn, now in her late 20s, was determined not to let that happen to her. The fire that had been ignited by her father's death still burned within her, and each day it seemed to grow stronger. In the years following her high school graduation, Evelyn had taken on the role of caregiver for her younger siblings, working tirelessly to help her mother keep the family afloat. She had put her own dreams on hold, focusing instead on survival. But as her siblings grew older and more independent, Evelyn found herself with a little more time to think about her future. The idea of going back to school and pursuing a career in medicine had never left her mind, but the path forward seemed as daunting as ever. It was around this time that Evelyn met Charles Matthews, a quiet but kind man who worked as a mechanic at a nearby garage. Charles was immediately taken by Evelyn's strength and determination, and it wasn't long before the two were inseparable. They married within a year, and Evelyn took on a job as a nurse's aide at a local clinic to help support their growing family. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was a life she was grateful for. Evelyn's work at the clinic was both rewarding and challenging. The patients she cared for were often elderly or terminally ill, and many came from the same underprivileged backgrounds as her own family. She saw firsthand the toll that poverty and lack of access to quality healthcare could take on a person. These experiences only deepened her desire to do more, to be more, for the people who needed it most. But the realities of her situation were hard to ignore. Between raising her two children, Jessica and Malcolm, and working long hours at the clinic, Evelyn found it difficult to imagine how she could ever return to school, let alone pursue a career in medicine. Charles, though supportive in many ways, was also a pragmatist. He loved Evelyn deeply, but he struggled to understand her desire to chase what seemed to him an impossible dream. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Evelyn sat down at the kitchen table with Charles, a serious expression on her face. "Charles, I've been thinking a lot about the future," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to go back to school. I want to become a doctor. Charles looked up from his newspaper, surprise flashing across his face. Evie, you've got your hands full as it is, he replied gently. You're working, taking care of the kids. How do you plan on fitting school into all of that? And becoming a doctor? That's years of schooling, not to mention the cost. Evelyn nodded, understanding his concerns. I know it's a lot, and I know it won't be easy, but I can't stop thinking about it. Every day at the clinic, I see people who need more help than I can give them. I want to be the one who can make a difference, who can save lives, not just comfort people when it's too late. Charles sighed, placing his newspaper on the table. Evie, I'm not saying you shouldn't follow your dreams, but we have to be realistic. You're talking about a huge commitment, time, money, energy. What about the kids? What about us? Evelyn's heart ached as she heard the doubt in his voice, but she knew she couldn't let go of her dream. Charles, I'm willing to make sacrifices. I'll take classes at night after work, and I'll find scholarships or financial aid to help with the cost. I've been doing some research and I think it's possible. I just need your support. Charles reached across the table and took her hand in his. I love you, Evie, and I want you to be happy. But I'm worried about what this will do to you, to us. I don't want to see you get hurt if it doesn't work out. Evelyn squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with determination. I appreciate that, Charles, but I have to try. If I don't, I'll always wonder what could have been. I don't want to live with that regret. Charles nodded slowly, seeing the resolve in her eyes. He knew there was no changing her mind once it was made up. All right, Evie, if this is what you really want, then I'll support you. But promise me you'll take care of yourself and not push too hard. Evelyn smiled, relief washing over her. Thank you, Charles. I promise I'll take it one step at a time. But I need to do this. For me, for our kids, and for all the people I can help. With Charles's reluctant blessing, Evelyn began to take the first steps toward her dream. She enrolled in night classes at a nearby community college, focusing on the science courses she needed to fulfill the prerequisites for medical school. Balancing her responsibilities at home and work with her studies was no easy feat, but Evelyn was nothing if not determined. She often stayed up late into the night, studying after the kids were asleep, her mind buzzing with facts about biology, chemistry, and human anatomy. The workload was immense, and there were times when Evelyn wondered if she had taken on more than she could handle. But every time she felt doubt creeping in, she reminded herself of her father's words. You can be anything you want, baby girl. Those words echoed in her mind, driving her forward even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. One of the most challenging aspects of her journey was the lack of understanding and support from those around her. While Charles did his best to help with the children and household chores, he often voiced his concerns about the toll her studies were taking on her health and their family life. Evelyn's mother, Louise, was even less supportive, dismissing her daughter's ambitions as impractical and unrealistic. Evelyn, you're not a young woman anymore, Louise would say, shaking her head in disbelief. You've got 2 kids and a husband to take care of. What makes you think you can just up and go to medical school? It's time to let go of these childish dreams and focus on what really matters, your family. Evelyn would listen to her mother's words with a heavy heart, but she refused to let them deter her. She knew that her mother's skepticism came from a place of love and concern, but it also came from a lifetime of lowered expectations and deferred dreams. Evelyn was determined not to let those same limitations define her life. Despite the challenges, Evelyn found strength and inspiration in unexpected places. One day, while working at the clinic, she met a young woman named Maya who had come in for a routine checkup. Maya was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet while caring for her 2 young children. But what struck Evelyn the most about Maya was her story. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer a year earlier but had delayed seeking treatment because she couldn't afford the medical bills. Maya's story hit Evelyn like a punch to the gut. Here was a woman, not much younger than herself, who was fighting for her life against a disease that could have been treated if only she had access to the care she needed. Evelyn listened as Maya spoke, her voice tinged with both fear and hope. I just want to see my kids grow up, Maya said, her eyes filled with tears. "I want to be there for them, to watch them graduate, to see them get married. But I'm so scared that I won't make it." Evelyn's heart ached for Maya, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that there were so many others like Maya, people who were slipping through the cracks of a broken healthcare system, their lives cut short because they couldn't afford the care they needed. It was in that moment that Evelyn's determination solidified. She would become a doctor, not just for herself, but for all the Mayas out there who needed someone to fight for them. After that day, Evelyn threw herself into her studies with even greater fervor. She sought out mentors, doctors and professors who could guide her on her journey, and she joined a small group of women at the community college who were also pursuing careers in healthcare. These women, from diverse backgrounds and with their own unique struggles, became Evelyn's support system. Together, they encouraged each other, shared resources, and celebrated each other's successes. The bond between these women was unbreakable, forged in the fires of shared hardship and determination. They called themselves the Night Owls, a nod to their late-night study sessions and their refusal to let go of their dreams, no matter how difficult the path. Evelyn found comfort and strength in their camaraderie, and it helped her to push through the toughest times. As the years went by, Evelyn slowly but surely completed the courses she needed to apply to medical school. It was a grueling process, but with each passing semester, she grew more confident in her abilities. She knew that the road ahead would still be long and challenging, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Her determination had taken root and begun to blossom, fueled by the belief that she could make a difference in the world, one life at a time. Evelyn's journey was far from over, but she had taken the first crucial steps toward her goal. She was no longer just a woman with a dream. She was a woman with a plan, and she was determined to see it through to the end. No matter how many obstacles stood in her way, Evelyn knew that she would find a way to overcome them. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. The small, windowless classroom in Chicago's South Side Community College buzzed with the sound of rustling papers and murmured conversations. It was a cold winter evening in the late 1990s, and Evelyn Matthews, now in her late 30s, sat at the front of the room, her notebook open and her pen poised to take notes. The familiar scent of chalk and old textbooks filled the air, a comforting reminder of the countless nights she had spent here, steadily working her way through the courses that would one day take her to medical school. Evelyn had come a long way since that first night she nervously walked into the classroom, feeling out of place among the younger students. Now, she was a seasoned veteran, confident in her ability to keep up with the demanding coursework. But despite her growing confidence, the road she had chosen was anything but easy. At home, life was a constant balancing act. Charles, her husband, had initially supported her decision to return to school, but as the years went by, his patience began to wear thin. The long hours Evelyn spent studying and attending classes took a toll on their marriage, and the distance between them grew wider with each passing day. Charles, who had once admired her determination, now resented the time she spent away from their family. "I don't understand why you keep doing this, Evie," Charles said one evening, his voice heavy with frustration. "You're burning the candle at both ends, and for what? By the time you finish school, you'll be too old to work as a doctor. What about the kids? What about us?" Evelyn looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She knew he was right in some ways. She was exhausted, and the strain of juggling her responsibilities was taking its toll. But the thought of giving up now, after coming so far, was unbearable. "I know it's hard, Charles," she replied softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I can't give up. I have to see this through. I need to do this, for me and for our future." Charles sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Evie. You're putting everything on the line for a dream that might not even come true." Evelyn reached out, placing her hand over his. "I understand your concerns, but I've made it this far. I can't stop now. I promise, once I'm finished with school, things will get better. We'll have more time together, and the kids will see that it was all worth it." But even as she spoke the words, Evelyn knew it was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The truth was, She had no idea what the future held, or if she would even be able to finish her education. The challenges she faced seemed insurmountable at times, but she pushed forward, driven by a deep sense of purpose that refused to be extinguished. Her children, Jessica and Malcolm, were now teenagers, and their demands on her time and energy were greater than ever. Jessica, a bright and independent young woman, was beginning to explore her own future, while Malcolm, who struggled with school, required more of Evelyn's attention to stay on track. There were nights when Evelyn felt like she was failing as a mother, torn between her studies and her family's needs. But she refused to let guilt consume her. She was determined to show her children that it was never too late to pursue one's dreams, no matter how difficult the journey. One evening, after another argument with Charles about the time she spent away from home, Evelyn found herself sitting alone in the small office she had set up in their apartment. The room was cluttered with textbooks, notes, and a computer that hummed softly as she worked on an assignment. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the screen, her vision blurring as the stress and exhaustion finally caught up with her. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her responsibilities and the fear that she might not succeed. The thought of giving up, of returning to a life where she no longer had to fight so hard, was tempting. But just as she was about to close her computer and call it a night, something caught her eye. On the corner of her desk sat a small, framed photograph of her father, Henry Matthews. The picture was old and faded, but the image was still clear. Her father, smiling warmly at the camera, his eyes filled with pride and love. Evelyn picked up the photo, cradling it in her hands as memories of him flooded her mind. Her father had always believed in her, even when no one else did. He had seen something in her, a spark of potential that he had nurtured with every word of encouragement and every moment they spent together. Evelyn could almost hear his voice, soft but firm, telling her that she could do anything she set her mind to. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered to the photograph, "I miss you, Daddy. I wish you were here to see this. I'm trying so hard, but it feels like everything is falling apart. I don't know if I can do this without you." But even as she spoke the words, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of determination welling up inside her. She knew that her father would never have wanted her to give up, no matter how difficult things became. He had always taught her to keep pushing forward, to never let the world's obstacles stand in the way of her dreams. With a deep breath, Evelyn wiped away her tears and placed the photograph back on her desk. She turned back to her computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she prepared to finish her assignment. The doubts and fears were still there, but they were no longer overwhelming. She could do this. She had to do this, not just for herself, but for her father, her children, and everyone who had ever believed in her. The following weeks were some of the hardest Evelyn had ever faced. The tension at home was palpable, with Charles growing more distant and her children growing more resentful of the time she spent away from them. But Evelyn pressed on, pouring herself into her studies and refusing to let the challenges deter her. It was during this time that Evelyn's small group of friends from the community college, the Night Owls, became her lifeline. They were all women who, like Evelyn, had faced their own share of struggles and setbacks in their pursuit of education. Each of them brought their own unique perspective to the group, and together, they formed a bond that helped them all stay focused on their goals. The group met regularly at the local library, huddling together over their textbooks and study guides as they worked through the material. The library, with its warm lighting and quiet atmosphere, became a sanctuary for Evelyn, a place where she could focus entirely on her studies without the distractions and tensions of home. The women in the group supported each other in ways that went beyond academics. They shared their personal struggles, offering advice and encouragement when one of them felt like giving up. They celebrated each other's successes, no matter how small, and provided a safe space where they could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. It was through this group that Evelyn met Karen, a single mother who was also pursuing a career in healthcare. Karen's story was similar to Evelyn's. She had faced countless obstacles in her life, including a difficult divorce and the challenges of raising her children on her own. But Karen was determined to succeed, and her resilience inspired Evelyn to keep going, even on the darkest days. One evening, After a particularly intense study session, Evelyn and Karen sat together in the quiet of the library, sipping coffee as they talked about their lives. Karen, with her fiery red hair and quick wit, had a way of making even the most serious conversations feel lighthearted. "You know, Evie," Karen said, stirring her coffee with a plastic spoon, "sometimes I wonder if we're all just a little bit crazy for doing this. I mean, who in their right mind would willingly sign up for this kind of torture?" Evelyn laughed, the sound of it surprising even herself. It had been so long since she'd felt the urge to laugh. "Yeah, maybe we are crazy," she replied, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "But I'd rather be crazy and chasing my dreams than sitting at home, wondering what could have been." Karen nodded, her expression turning serious. "You're right. I'd rather be here, fighting for something that matters, than just accepting things the way they are. We're not just doing this for ourselves, you know? We're doing it for our kids, for our communities. We're showing them that it's never too late to go after what you want." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat at Karen's words. She had never thought of it that way before, but it was true. By pursuing her dream, she was setting an example for her children, showing them that they didn't have to settle for less than they deserved. She was proving to them, and to herself, that anything was possible with enough determination and hard work. As the weeks turned into months, Evelyn's resolve only grew stronger. She continued to attend her classes, study late into the night, and work at the clinic during the day. The challenges she faced were many, but she refused to let them break her. Her friends in the Night Owls were there for her every step of the way, providing the support and encouragement she needed to keep going. One day, after completing a particularly grueling set of exams, Evelyn received the results she had been waiting for. She had passed with flying colors. The relief and pride she felt were indescribable. It was a small victory, but it was enough to remind her that she was on the right path. But just as Evelyn began to feel like she was making progress, life threw another curveball her way. Charles, who had grown increasingly distant over the past few months, announced that he wanted a separation. The news hit Evelyn like a ton of bricks. She had known that their marriage was struggling, but she had never expected it to come to this. "Charles, are you sure this is what you want?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling as she tried to keep her emotions in check. Charles looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't know what I want, Evie," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I just know that things aren't working between us anymore. You're so focused on school and your career, and I feel like I'm just in the way. Maybe we need some time apart to figure things out." Evelyn's heart broke as she listened to his words. She had never wanted this. She had always believed that they could make it work, even with the challenges they faced. But deep down, she knew that Charles was right. Their marriage had become strained, and they had grown apart in ways that neither of them could fix. "If this is what you need, then I'll support you," Evelyn said quietly, her voice filled with sadness. "But I want you to know that I never wanted to hurt you or the kids. I'm doing this because it's something I have to do, for myself and for our future." Charles nodded, his eyes filled with pain. "I know, Evie, and I'm not saying you should stop. I just need some time to figure out where I fit into all of this." With that, Charles moved out of their apartment, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and fears. The separation was amicable, but it left a void in her life that was difficult to fill. For the first time in years, Evelyn was truly on her own, with nothing but her determination and the support of her friends to keep her going. The loss of her marriage was a painful blow, but Evelyn refused to let it derail her. She continued to press forward, knowing that the road ahead would be even more difficult without Charles by her side. But she was not deterred. If anything, the challenges she faced only strengthened her resolve. She had come too far to turn back now. As Evelyn sat in her small, quiet apartment, the walls lined with textbooks and notes, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced more obstacles than she ever could have imagined, but she had also discovered a strength within herself that she never knew existed. The road she had chosen was lonely and fraught with difficulties, but it was the road she was meant to travel. Evelyn Matthews was a woman on a mission, and nothing, no setback, no challenge, no heartbreak, would stop her from reaching her goal. She had chosen the road less traveled, and she would see it through to the end, no matter where it led. The chill of winter lingered in the air as Evelyn Matthews stood outside the clinic, her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. She glanced at the sky, the gray clouds reflecting her somber mood. It had been another long day at work, the kind that left her physically and emotionally drained. But there was no time to rest. Her final pre-med exams were approaching, and she had hours of studying ahead of her. Yet, as she stared at the clinic's brick facade, an overwhelming sense of exhaustion washed over her, heavier than anything she had felt before. Evelyn knew she was reaching her breaking point. The weight of her responsibilities, the dissolution of her marriage, and the relentless demands of her studies had begun to chip away at her resolve. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to persevere in the face of adversity. But now, as she walked home through the cold streets of Chicago, she felt that strength slipping away. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun had set, leaving the city bathed in darkness. The small, cramped space that she had once shared with Charles and their children felt emptier than ever. Jessica was away at college, and Malcolm, who had struggled through his teenage years, had recently moved in with his father after their separation. Evelyn was proud of her children, but their absence left her feeling more alone than she had ever imagined. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the worn couch, closing her eyes and letting out a long, shaky breath. The silence of the apartment was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos of her life. She knew she needed to study, to prepare for the exams that could make or break her chances of getting into medical school, but the thought of opening another textbook made her stomach churn. Evelyn opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with doubts and fears. What if she failed? What if she wasn't cut out for this? What if she had sacrificed everything, her marriage, her time with her children, her own well-being, for a dream that was slipping further out of reach with each passing day? The anxiety that had been building inside her for months suddenly erupted, and Evelyn found herself sobbing uncontrollably, her body trembling with the force of her emotions. She had always tried to be strong, to hold everything together, but in that moment, she felt as though she was falling apart. All the pain, the fear, the loneliness, it all came crashing down on her, and she had no idea how to stop it. For what felt like hours, Evelyn cried, releasing all the pent-up frustration and despair that she had kept bottled up inside. When the tears finally subsided, she felt empty, hollow, as if all the fight had been drained from her. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but she didn't know how to keep going, either. In the quiet aftermath of her breakdown, Evelyn sat up and wiped her tear-streaked face. Her eyes were swollen, her head ached, and her heart felt heavy. But she couldn't stay in that dark place. She needed to find a way forward, even if she didn't know where that would lead. With a deep breath, Evelyn reached for the framed photograph of her father that sat on the coffee table. She had spoken to him often in her mind, seeking guidance and comfort, but tonight, the distance between them felt greater than ever. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I don't know what to do. I'm so tired, and I'm so scared. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going." The room remained silent, offering no answers, no comfort. But as Evelyn stared at the photograph, something shifted inside her. A small, flickering ember of determination that refused to be extinguished. She had come too far to give up now. She had survived too much to let this dream slip through her fingers. Evelyn closed her eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding herself in the moment. She remembered all the reasons she had started this journey. The memory of her father, the desire to help people like Maya, the promise she had made to herself all those years ago. Those reasons still mattered. They were still worth fighting for. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and walked to her bedroom, where her textbooks and notes were scattered across the desk. The sight of them filled her with a mixture of dread and determination. She knew she had to keep studying, keep pushing forward, even if it felt impossible. But as Evelyn sat down at the desk and opened her notebook, she was interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something compelled her to pick up. "Hello?" she answered, her voice still hoarse from crying. "Evelyn? It's Karen." The familiar voice of her friend and fellow night owl brought a sense of relief that Evelyn hadn't realized she needed. "Karen," Evelyn replied, trying to steady her voice. "It's good to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm okay. But that's not why I'm calling," Karen said, her tone gentle but concerned. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know this is a really tough time for you, and I just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." Evelyn's throat tightened as she listened to Karen's words. She had always tried to put on a brave face for her friends, to show them that she could handle anything that came her way. But tonight, she couldn't pretend anymore. "Karen, I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Everything feels like it's falling apart, and I'm so tired. I just don't know if I'm strong enough." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Karen's voice came through, filled with empathy and understanding. "Evie, you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to feel tired, to feel scared. But I know you, and I know how much this means to you. You've come so far, and I believe in you. We all do." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Karen's words were exactly what she needed to hear, a lifeline in the darkness. "Thank you, Karen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I needed that. I needed to hear that someone believes in me." "I do believe in you, Evie," Karen replied firmly. "And I know you can do this. But you don't have to do it alone. Let me help you. Let all of us help you. We're in this together, remember?" Evelyn nodded, even though Karen couldn't see her. "I remember," she said softly. "And I'm so grateful for you and everyone else in the group. I don't know what I'd do without you." Karen's voice softened. "We're a team, Evie, and we're not going to let you fall. So here's what we're going to do. I'm coming over to your place tomorrow, and we're going to study together. We'll go over everything you need for the exams, and we'll make a plan to get you through this. You don't have to do it all on your own." The thought of having someone by her side, of not having to face the mountain of work alone, brought a sense of relief that Evelyn hadn't realized she needed. "That sounds wonderful, Karen," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough." "You don't have to thank me," Karen said with a smile in her voice. "Just promise me you'll take it one step at a time. We'll get through this together." After hanging up the phone, Evelyn felt a small but significant weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead was still daunting, but it no longer felt insurmountable. She had people in her corner, people who believed in her and were willing to help her carry the load. The next day, Karen arrived at Evelyn's apartment with a bag full of textbooks, notebooks, and snacks. The two women spent hours poring over the material, discussing concepts, and testing each other on key information. Karen's presence was a balm for Evelyn's frayed nerves, and she found herself laughing and smiling for the first time in weeks. As they worked together, Evelyn felt her confidence slowly returning. The material wasn't as overwhelming as it had seemed the night before, and with Karen's help, she was able to grasp the concepts that had been eluding her. By the end of the day, they had created a detailed study plan, one that broke down the work into manageable chunks. "I feel so much better," Evelyn admitted as they packed up their materials for the day. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Karen." Karen smiled warmly. "You're stronger than you think, Evie. But even the strongest people need a little help sometimes. Don't be afraid to lean on us when you need to." Evelyn nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for her friend's kindness and support. "I won't forget that," she promised. "And I'll be there for you, too, whenever you need me." The days leading up to the final exams were a blur of studying, late-night sessions with the night owls, and moments of doubt and anxiety. But with Karen and the others by her side, Evelyn felt more prepared than she ever had before. She knew the material and, more importantly, she believed in herself again. When the day of the exams finally arrived, Evelyn woke up early, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made her feel confident and ready to face the challenge ahead. As she stood in front of the mirror, she took a deep breath and whispered to her reflection, "You can do this." The exam room was filled with students, all of them focused and determined. As Evelyn took her seat, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. She had worked for this moment, and she was ready. The exam was difficult, but as she moved through the questions, she felt a sense of clarity and focus that had eluded her in the past. She knew the answers, and she trusted herself to do her best. When the exam was over, Evelyn walked out of the room with a sense of accomplishment. She didn't know her final score yet, but she felt proud of herself for making it this far. She had faced her fears, overcome her doubts, and given everything she had to reach this point. A few weeks later, the exam results were posted online. Evelyn's hands trembled as she logged into the portal, her heart racing with anticipation. When the page loaded and she saw her scores, she gasped in disbelief. She had passed with flying colors, exceeding even her own expectations. Tears of joy filled her eyes as she stared at the screen, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. All the pain, the sacrifice, the late nights, and the tears. It had all been worth it. She had done it. She had succeeded. Evelyn immediately called Karen and the rest of the Night Owls to share the news. The group erupted in cheers and congratulations, their voices filled with pride and excitement for their friend's achievement. "I knew you could do it, Evie," Karen exclaimed, her voice full of emotion. "This is just the beginning. You're going to make an amazing doctor." Evelyn smiled through her tears, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment that she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still long, and there were many more challenges to come, but for the first time in months, she felt like she was on solid ground. She had faced the storm and come out stronger on the other side. But even as Evelyn celebrated her success, she knew there was still one more hurdle to overcome: the application process for medical school. The exams had been a major victory, but now she had to face the daunting task of applying to some of the most competitive programs in the country. Evelyn spent the next several months gathering letters of recommendation, writing personal statements, and carefully selecting the schools where she would apply. It was a meticulous process, one that required patience, attention to detail, and a deep belief in herself and her abilities. As the months passed, Evelyn sent off her applications with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She knew the odds were against her. She was older than most applicants, and her unconventional path to medicine could be seen as a liability rather than an asset. But she refused to let those doubts overshadow her accomplishments. She had worked too hard to let fear hold her back. And then the waiting began. The weeks stretched into months, and Evelyn found herself checking the mail and her email inbox obsessively, hoping for a response. The uncertainty was agonizing, and there were days when she felt like the pressure was too much to bear. But she reminded herself that she had faced worse and survived. Whatever the outcome, she would find a way to keep moving forward. Finally, one crisp morning in early spring, Evelyn received the email she had been waiting for. Her heart pounded as she opened it, her eyes scanning the text for the words that would change her life. It was a rejection, the first of many. Evelyn felt her heart sink as she read the polite but impersonal words of the rejection letter. It was the first major blow to her confidence since the exams, and it shook her to her core. She had known the process would be competitive, but she hadn't been prepared for the sting of rejection. But Evelyn didn't let herself wallow in disappointment for long. She knew she couldn't afford to. There were other applications still pending, and she refused to give up hope. She would keep fighting, keep pushing until she found a way in. Over the next few weeks, more rejection letters arrived, each one a painful reminder of how difficult this journey truly was. But amidst the rejections, there was one small glimmer of hope: an invitation to interview at Harvard Medical School. Evelyn stared at the email in disbelief, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. Harvard was one of the most prestigious medical schools in the world, and the fact that they had noticed her application was nothing short of a miracle. But with that opportunity came immense pressure. This was her chance, her one shot at making her dream a reality, and she knew she couldn't afford to fail. She spent the days leading up to the interview preparing meticulously, rehearsing her answers to potential questions, and reviewing her personal statement until she knew it by heart. Karen and the other Night Owls offered their support, helping her practice and providing encouragement when her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. On the day of the interview, Evelyn flew to Boston with her heart in her throat. She had never felt more nervous in her life, but she reminded herself of everything she had overcome to get to this point. She had faced down her fears, survived heartbreak, and proven that she was capable of achieving great things. Now, she just had to show the admissions committee that she was ready for this next step. The interview itself was intense, with the committee members asking probing questions about her background, her motivations, and how she planned to handle the challenges of medical school at her age. But Evelyn answered each question with honesty and passion, drawing on her life experiences and the deep sense of purpose that had driven her to this point. When the interview was over, Evelyn left the room feeling both exhilarated and exhausted. She had given it everything she had, and now all she could do was wait. A few weeks later, the letter from Harvard arrived. Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words, "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Harvard Medical School class of 2024. Evelyn gasped, tears streaming down her face as she realized what this meant. She had done it. She had been accepted to Harvard Medical School. After all the setbacks, all the sacrifices, all the heartbreak, she had made it. She immediately called Karen, her voice trembling with emotion as she shared the news. "Karen, I got in. I'm going to Harvard." Karen screamed with joy, her excitement echoing through the phone. "I knew you could do it, Evie. This is incredible. You're going to be an amazing doctor." As Evelyn hung up the phone, she sat down on her couch, the weight of everything she had been through finally lifting from her shoulders. She had reached the breaking point and survived. She had faced rejection and found acceptance. And now, she was about to embark on the most challenging and rewarding journey of her life. The road to Harvard had been long and difficult, but Evelyn knew that the real journey was just beginning. She had proven to herself and to the world that she was capable of achieving her dreams. And now it was time to make those dreams a reality. The sun was just beginning to rise over the historic buildings of Harvard University as Evelyn Matthews stepped off the subway and made her way to the entrance of the Harvard Medical School. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves and the excitement of a new beginning. Evelyn, now in her early 50s, stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the grand, red brick buildings that had been the dream of countless aspiring doctors. Today, she was one of them. As she walked through the gates, Evelyn felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. Her journey to this point had been long and arduous, marked by countless setbacks and challenges. But with every step she took on this hallowed ground, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made it to Harvard, something that had seemed impossible not so long ago, and now she was determined to prove that she belonged here. The first few weeks of medical school were overwhelming, to say the least. Evelyn had known that the workload would be intense, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the sheer volume of information she was expected to absorb. Anatomy, biochemistry, physiology, the subjects were vast and complex, and Evelyn found herself studying late into the night, struggling to keep up with her younger classmates, many of whom had come directly from rigorous undergraduate programs. Despite her years of experience as a nurse's aide and the countless hours she had spent studying to prepare for this moment, Evelyn often felt like an outsider. She was one of the oldest students in her class, and she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from her peers, the whispered comments about her age. While most of her classmates bonded over shared experiences and late-night study sessions, Evelyn often felt isolated, her life experiences setting her apart from the others. The academic pressure was relentless, and there were times when Evelyn wondered if she had made a mistake. She had worked so hard to get here, but what if she wasn't capable of handling the demands of medical school? What if she had sacrificed everything for a dream that was out of reach? These thoughts plagued her as she sat in the lecture hall, surrounded by students who seemed so much more confident, so much more prepared. But Evelyn refused to let doubt take root. She reminded herself of all the obstacles she had overcome to get to this point. The loss of her marriage, the struggles of raising her children, the countless hours spent studying and working to make ends meet. She had faced down every challenge life had thrown at her, and she wasn't about to let this one defeat her. One day, after a particularly grueling anatomy lab, Evelyn sat in the library, her head bowed over a stack of textbooks. She was reviewing her notes on the brachial plexus, a complex network of nerves in the shoulder, but the words on the page seemed to blur together, her exhaustion making it difficult to focus. As she rubbed her temples, trying to ward off the headache that had been building all day, she heard a voice behind her. You know, that's one of the trickiest parts of anatomy. It took me ages to wrap my head around it. Evelyn looked up to see a young man standing next to her table, his expression friendly and sympathetic. He was tall, with dark hair and a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Evelyn nodded, grateful for the company. "Sure, go ahead." He set down his backpack and took a seat, pulling out his own stack of textbooks. "I'm James, by the way. First year, like you." "Evelyn," she replied, returning his smile. "Nice to meet you, James." James glanced at the textbook she had been studying, his brow furrowing slightly. "The brachial plexus, huh? That's a tough one. I remember getting so frustrated with it last week. But I found a trick that really helped me. Do you mind if I show you?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment, feeling a flicker of self-doubt. She didn't want to admit how much she was struggling, but something about James's genuine offer of help made her feel like it was okay to accept. "I'd really appreciate that," she said, pushing her notebook toward him. For the next hour, James patiently walked Evelyn through the intricate details of the brachial plexus, using a series of diagrams and mnemonics that made the material much more manageable. As they worked together, Evelyn found herself relaxing, the information beginning to click in a way it hadn't before. James had a natural gift for teaching, and his easygoing manner made the material feel less intimidating. When they finally finished, Evelyn felt a sense of accomplishment that had eluded her for weeks. "Thank you, James," she said sincerely. "You have no idea how much that helped." James shrugged modestly. "We're all in this together, right? Besides, it's good practice for me, too. I figure if I can explain it to someone else, I must really understand it." Evelyn smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Well, you're a great teacher. I've been struggling with this for days, but now I finally feel like I'm getting it." James leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "You know, I've noticed you in class. You're always so focused, so determined. I think it's really inspiring." Evelyn felt a blush creep up her cheeks, surprised by his compliment. "Thank you. I've worked so hard to get here. I don't want to let myself down." James nodded, his expression understanding. "I get that, but you don't have to do it all on your own. We're all struggling with this stuff, and it helps to have people to lean on." Evelyn looked at him, her heart softening. She had spent so much time trying to prove herself, trying to show that she belonged, that she had forgotten how important it was to have support, to build connections with others who were on the same journey. "Thank you, James," she said again, her voice filled with gratitude. "I think I needed to hear that." Over the next few weeks, James and Evelyn formed a close friendship, often meeting in the library to study together or discuss their experiences in medical school. James introduced her to a small group of students who were also struggling with the demands of the program, and together, they formed a study group that quickly became a lifeline for Evelyn. For the first time since starting medical school, Evelyn felt like she was part of a community. Her classmates, who had once seemed so distant and unapproachable, became her allies, her friends. They supported each other through the tough exams, celebrated each other's successes, and provided a sense of camaraderie that Evelyn had been missing. But even as Evelyn found her footing academically, she continued to face challenges that went beyond the classroom. As one of the few Black women in her program, she often felt the sting of subtle discrimination, the unspoken assumptions that she wasn't as capable as her peers, that she didn't belong. There were times when she would overhear conversations between her classmates, the casual remarks that revealed their biases. "Can you believe she's still here?" One student had whispered to another as they passed by Evelyn in the hallway. "I thought for sure she'd drop out by now." The words stung, but Evelyn refused to let them undermine her confidence. She knew that she had earned her place here, that she was just as deserving as anyone else. But the constant need to prove herself, to push back against the stereotypes and expectations, was exhausting. One day, after a particularly grueling lab session, Evelyn found herself alone in the cafeteria, staring at her untouched lunch. The isolation she felt, the sense of being an outsider in a place that was supposed to be her dream, weighed heavily on her. "Is this seat taken?" Evelyn looked up to see a man standing in front of her table, holding a tray of food. He was older than the other students, perhaps in his early 40s, with a kind face and a gentle smile. "No, it's not," Evelyn replied, gesturing for him to sit down. "Thanks," he said, setting his tray down and taking a seat across from her. "I'm Dr. Thomas, one of the anatomy professors. I've seen you around campus, but I don't think we've had the chance to talk yet." Evelyn felt a pang of nerves at the thought of speaking with a professor, especially one she hadn't met before. "It's nice to meet you, Dr. Thomas."
I'm Evelyn Matthews.
"I know who you are," Dr. Thomas said with a smile. "You're one of the few students who actually looks interested during my lectures." Evelyn couldn't help but laugh, feeling some of her tension melt away. "Well, I try to be. There's so much to learn, and I don't want to miss any of it." Dr. Thomas nodded, his expression turning serious. "You've impressed a lot of people here, Evelyn. I've heard your name come up in conversations with other professors, and they all say the same thing. You're one of the most dedicated students we've seen in a long time." Evelyn felt a surge of pride at his words, but it was quickly tempered by the doubts that had been nagging at her since she started the program. "Thank you, Dr. Thomas. That means a lot to me. But, if I'm being honest, I sometimes wonder if I really belong here. It's been so difficult, and I feel like I'm constantly trying to prove myself." Dr. Thomas studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "I understand how you feel, Evelyn. Medical school is hard enough without the added pressure of feeling like you have to prove your worth. But let me tell you something, you do belong here. You've earned your place, and you have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat at his words. "It's just, I'm one of the oldest students here, and I feel like everyone else has this advantage over me. They're younger, faster, and they've been studying this material for years. Sometimes I wonder if I'm out of my depth." Dr. Thomas shook his head, his expression firm. "Don't underestimate yourself, Evelyn. Experience is a powerful tool, and you have life experience that many of your classmates don't. You've faced challenges that have shaped you, that have given you a perspective and resilience that will serve you well in this field. You may feel like you're at a disadvantage, but in reality, you have strengths that will make you an excellent doctor." Evelyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she listened to Dr. Thomas's words. For so long, she had been battling her own insecurities, questioning whether she was truly capable of succeeding in this demanding environment. But hearing someone like Dr. Thomas, a respected professor who had seen countless students come and go, express such confidence in her abilities filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Dr. Thomas," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "I really needed to hear that." Dr. Thomas smiled warmly. "You're welcome, Evelyn, and if you ever need someone to talk to, or if you're struggling with anything, my door is always open. You're not alone in this." Evelyn nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for Dr. Thomas's kindness. "I'll remember that. Thank you." As Dr. Thomas stood to leave, he placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to do great things, Evelyn. Don't let anyone or anything make you doubt that." Over the next few months, Evelyn threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. The support from her friends, her classmates, and mentors like Dr. Thomas helped her to stay focused and motivated, even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. She found that the more she applied herself, the more confident she became in her abilities. The material that had once felt overwhelming began to make sense, and she started to excel in her coursework. But the true test of Evelyn's resolve came during her clinical rotations. As a medical student, she was required to spend time in different hospital departments, working alongside doctors and nurses, and applying the knowledge she had gained in the classroom to real-life situations. It was an exhilarating but daunting experience, one that pushed her to her limits. Evelyn's first rotation was in the cardiology department, a fitting placement given her father's history of hypertension and heart disease. The experience was both challenging and deeply personal, as she worked with patients who reminded her of her father. Men and women who were suffering from the same conditions that had claimed his life. One patient, in particular, left a lasting impression on Evelyn. Mr. Rodriguez was a middle-aged man who had come into the hospital with severe chest pain. He was diagnosed with a rare condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, often referred to as broken heart syndrome. The condition, which mimics a heart attack, is often triggered by severe emotional or physical stress. Evelyn was assigned to Mr. Rodriguez's case, and she quickly developed a rapport with him. He was a quiet, stoic man, but over time, he opened up to her about the stresses in his life. His wife's recent death, the financial pressures of supporting his family, and the fear that he wouldn't be there for his children. As Evelyn listened to Mr. Rodriguez's story, she felt a deep sense of empathy for him. She understood the toll that stress and loss could take on a person's heart, both physically and emotionally. She also felt a renewed sense of responsibility to help him in any way she could. Throughout his stay in the hospital, Evelyn was a constant presence at Mr. Rodriguez's bedside, providing not only medical care but also emotional support. She explained his condition to him in simple terms, reassured him when he was scared, and even sat with him during the quiet hours when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm him. Mr. Rodriguez's condition gradually improved, and on the day he was discharged, he took Evelyn's hand in his and looked her in the eye. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You saved my life, in more ways than one." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm not a doctor yet, Mr. Rodriguez." "You're going to be a great doctor," he replied, his grip on her hand tightening. "I can feel it. You have a gift, and I'm grateful that you were here when I needed you." As Evelyn watched Mr. Rodriguez leave the hospital, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was why she had fought so hard to get here. This was what all the sacrifices, the struggles, and the late nights had been for. To make a difference in people's lives, to provide care and compassion to those who needed it most. Evelyn's rotation in cardiology marked a turning point for her. She realized that she had finally found her place, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The doubts that had plagued her at the beginning of her journey began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence in her abilities. With each new rotation, Evelyn's skills and knowledge grew. She excelled in her clinical work, earning the respect of her supervisors and the admiration of her peers. But more importantly, she connected with her patients on a personal level, drawing on her own life experiences to provide care that was both compassionate and effective. By the end of her third year of medical school, Evelyn had developed a reputation as one of the most dedicated and empathetic students in her program. She was no longer just the older student who had fought her way into Harvard. She was a future doctor, a healer, a woman who had found her calling. And while the road ahead was still long, with many challenges yet to come, Evelyn knew that she had the strength, the support, and the determination to see it through. She had faced her fears, overcome her doubts, and found a glimmer of hope in the most unlikely of places. As Evelyn stood on the threshold of her final year of medical school, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She had made it this far, and she was ready to take the next step on her journey. The dream that had once seemed impossible was now within her grasp, and she was determined to make it a reality. The corridors of the hospital were bustling with activity as Evelyn Matthews made her way to the cardiology ward. She was now in her final year at Harvard Medical School, and the end was finally in sight. The dream she had fought so hard to achieve was within reach, but the challenges had not lessened. If anything, they had grown more intense. Evelyn was now on clinical rotations full-time, where the stakes were higher and the pressure more relentless than ever. The transition from classroom learning to hands-on patient care had been exhilarating but also daunting. Evelyn was no stranger to the hospital environment, having worked as a nurse's aide for many years, but being a medical student carried a different kind of responsibility. She was no longer a bystander. She was expected to make decisions, to apply her knowledge in real time, and to contribute meaningfully to the care of patients. Evelyn entered the cardiology ward, her mind already focused on the tasks ahead. Today was going to be a particularly challenging day. She had been assigned to a complex case, a middle-aged woman with a history of hypertension and diabetes who had been admitted with severe congestive heart failure. The patient, Mrs. Caldwell, had been deteriorating rapidly despite the best efforts of the medical team. Evelyn knew that this case would test everything she had learned. As she approached the patient's room, she took a deep breath, centering herself. She reminded herself of the countless hours she had spent studying, of the sacrifices she had made, and of the people who believed in her. She was ready. When Evelyn entered Mrs. Caldwell's room, she was struck by the sight of the frail woman lying in the bed, her skin pale and her breathing labored. The monitors beeped steadily, displaying her vitals, which were far from stable. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes fluttered open as Evelyn approached, and she offered a weak smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," Evelyn said softly, taking the woman's hand in hers. "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Caldwell's voice was barely above a whisper. "Tired? But I'm glad to see you, Dr. Matthews." Evelyn smiled warmly. Though she was not yet a doctor, she appreciated the patient's trust. "I'm glad to see you too. We're going to do everything we can to help you feel better." As Evelyn began her assessment, she was joined by Dr. Anderson, the attending cardiologist, and a few other medical students who were part of the team. Dr. Anderson was a seasoned physician with a reputation for being both brilliant and demanding. Evelyn had learned a great deal from him during her rotation, but she also knew that he had high expectations. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Anderson said, his tone brisk as he scanned Mrs. Caldwell's chart. "Let's review what we know so far. Mrs. Caldwell has been experiencing worsening heart failure despite aggressive treatment. What do you think our next steps should be?" The room fell silent as the students considered the question. Evelyn felt the familiar stirrings of anxiety, but she pushed them aside, focusing on the patient in front of her. She had spent hours reviewing Mrs. Caldwell's case the night before, considering different treatment options and possible complications. Evelyn cleared her throat and spoke up, her voice steady. "Given Mrs. Caldwell's history of diabetes and hypertension, I believe we should consider adjusting her medication regimen. Specifically, we could increase the dosage of her ACE inhibitor to better manage her blood pressure and reduce the strain on her heart. Additionally, we might want to evaluate her kidney function more closely, as her declining renal function could be contributing to her fluid retention and worsening heart failure." Dr. Anderson nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "Interesting suggestions, Ms. Matthews. What would you recommend if her kidney function has deteriorated further?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment, considering her response. "If her kidney function has worsened, we may need to modify her diuretic therapy to prevent further renal impairment. We could consider switching to a different class of diuretics that are less likely to exacerbate her kidney issues. In the meantime, close monitoring of her electrolyte levels and renal function would be crucial." Dr. Anderson studied her for a moment before nodding in approval. "Good thinking, Ms. Matthews. We'll proceed with your recommendations and monitor her response. Let's see how she does over the next 24 hours." Evelyn felt a surge of relief and pride at Dr. Anderson's approval. As the team continued their discussion, she felt more confident in her ability to contribute meaningfully to the patient's care. But she also knew that this was just one step in a much larger journey. The day continued in a whirlwind of patient visits, chart reviews, and rounds with the attending physicians. Evelyn found herself constantly on the move, her mind racing to keep up with the demands of each case. But despite the intensity of the work, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was where she belonged, working with patients, applying her knowledge, and making a difference in people's lives. As the day drew to a close, Evelyn made her way back to Mrs. Caldwell's room to check on her one last time before heading home. The patient was sleeping peacefully, her vitals showing some signs of improvement. Evelyn stood by the bedside for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of Mrs. Caldwell's chest, and felt a sense of peace. "Good work today, Evelyn." Evelyn turned to see Dr. Anderson standing in the doorway, his expression softer than usual. "Thank you, Dr. Anderson," she replied, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. Dr. Anderson stepped into the room, his gaze shifting to Mrs. Caldwell. You showed good clinical judgment today. It's clear that you've put a lot of thought into this case. Evelyn nodded, her heart swelling with pride. I've learned a lot from you, Dr. Anderson, and from all the patients I've had the privilege of working with. Dr. Anderson smiled faintly. That's what makes a great doctor. Learning from every experience, every patient. Keep it up and you'll go far. As Dr. Anderson left the room, Evelyn took a moment to reflect on his words. The journey had been long and challenging, but she knew that every step had brought her closer to becoming the doctor she had always dreamed of being. The weeks passed in a blur as Evelyn continued her rotations, each one bringing new challenges and opportunities for growth. She spent time in the intensive care unit, where she learned to manage critically ill patients, and in the emergency department, where she honed her skills in quick decision-making and triage. Each experience added to her knowledge and confidence, reinforcing her belief that she was on the right path. But even as Evelyn thrived in her clinical work, she faced a new set of challenges. The demands of medical school had taken a toll on her personal life, leaving little time for anything outside of her studies. Her children, Jessica and Malcolm, were now adults, living their own lives, but Evelyn often felt guilty for not being there for them as much as she wanted. Jessica, who was now in her late 20s, had followed in her mother's footsteps and pursued a career in healthcare, working as a nurse in a busy urban hospital. Evelyn was immensely proud of her daughter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed out on so much of Jessica's life while she was consumed by her own studies. Malcolm, on the other hand, had struggled to find his way after high school. He had drifted from one job to another, never quite finding his passion, and Evelyn worried about him constantly. Their relationship had been strained ever since Charles had moved out, and Evelyn feared that she had failed him as a mother. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at the hospital, Evelyn returned to her apartment to find a message from Malcolm on her answering machine. His voice was hesitant, almost unsure. "Mom, it's Malcolm. I was wondering if we could talk. I need some advice, and I know you're busy, but I'd really appreciate it if you could call me back." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt as she listened to the message. It had been weeks since she had last spoken to Malcolm, and the thought that he needed her now, after she had been so absent from his life, filled her with a deep sense of regret. She quickly dialed his number, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had not been the mother she wanted to be. After a few rings, Malcolm answered, his voice tentative. "Mom? Is that you?" "Yes, it's me," Evelyn replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry I haven't called sooner. I've been so busy with school. But I'm here now. What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Malcolm spoke, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I don't know, Mom. I just feel lost. I've been trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, but nothing seems to stick. And I've been thinking a lot about Dad, about everything that happened after he left. I guess I just need to talk to someone." Evelyn's heart ached at the sound of her son's voice. She had always known that Malcolm had struggled to cope with the changes in their family, but hearing him express it so openly brought a rush of emotions. "Malcolm, I'm so sorry that I haven't been there for you. I've been so focused on my own journey, and I know I've let you down. But I want you to know that I'm here for you now, and I want to help in any way I can." Malcolm sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of his feelings. "I know you've been busy, Mom, and I'm proud of you for everything you've accomplished. But I guess I just miss the way things used to be, before everything changed." Evelyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she listened to her son. "I miss that too, Malcolm, but I also believe that change can be a good thing, can help us grow even if it's painful. And I want you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. We can figure this out together." There was a long pause before Malcolm spoke again, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot to me. I think I just need to know that I'm not alone in all of this." "You're never alone, Malcolm," Evelyn said, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm always here for you, no matter what, and I know that you're going to find your way. It might take some time, but I believe in you." The conversation with Malcolm weighed heavily on Evelyn's mind in the days that followed. She knew that she had made sacrifices to pursue her dream, and that those sacrifices had come at a cost to her family. But she also knew that she couldn't change the past. All she could do now was be there for her children, to support them as they navigated their own lives. As Evelyn continued her rotations, she made a conscious effort to reach out to Jessica and Malcolm more often, to stay connected despite the demands of medical school. It wasn't always easy. Her schedule was still grueling, and there were days when she barely had time to eat, let alone make phone calls. But she knew that staying connected to her family was just as important as her studies. One afternoon, after a long shift in the emergency department, Evelyn received a call from Jessica. Her daughter's voice was filled with excitement as she shared some good news. "Mom, you'll never guess what happened today." Evelyn smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest at the sound of her daughter's enthusiasm. "What happened, Jessica?" "I got promoted," Jessica exclaimed. "I'm going to be the charge nurse in the ICU starting next month." Evelyn's heart swelled with pride. "Jessica, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard for this, and you deserve it." "Thanks, Mom," Jessica said, her voice softening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've always been my role model, showing me what it means to be strong and determined." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to her daughter's words. "You're the one who did the work, Jessica. I'm just so glad to see you thriving. You're going to be an amazing charge nurse." As they continued to talk, Evelyn felt a sense of connection to her daughter that she had feared she had lost. The conversation reminded her of why she had pursued her dream in the first place: to make a difference, not just in her own life, but in the lives of her children and the people she cared for. The final months of Evelyn's medical school journey were a blur of rotations, exams, and preparation for the next phase, residency. The pressure was immense, but Evelyn had come to embrace it, knowing that each challenge brought her closer to achieving her dream. She applied to several residency programs, focusing on those with strong cardiology departments, as her experience in that field had deepened her passion for it. The application process was grueling, filled with interviews and long hours spent crafting personal statements. But Evelyn approached it with the same determination that had carried her through the toughest moments of her journey. When the day finally came for residency match results to be announced, Evelyn found herself surrounded by her classmates, all of them anxiously awaiting the news that would shape their futures. The tension in the room was palpable, and Evelyn's heart raced as she logged into the online portal to see where she had been matched. As the page loaded, Evelyn held her breath, her mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. And then there it was, her match. Evelyn had been accepted into a prestigious cardiology residency program at one of the top hospitals in the country. For a moment, Evelyn simply stared at the screen, unable to fully process what she was seeing. This was it. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, the realization of a dream that had once seemed impossible. Tears filled her eyes as she looked around the room at her classmates, all of them sharing in the joy and relief of having matched into their programs. This was the moment they had all been working toward, the moment that marked the beginning of their careers as doctors. Evelyn quickly called Jessica and Malcolm to share the news, her voice trembling with excitement. "I did it. I matched into cardiology." Both of her children erupted in cheers on the other end of the line, their voices filled with pride and happiness. "Mom, that's amazing," Jessica exclaimed. "I knew you could do it." "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Malcolm added, his voice filled with emotion. "You've shown me that anything is possible if you work hard enough." As Evelyn hung up the phone, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had faced so many challenges, overcome so many obstacles, and now she was finally on the brink of achieving her dream. But more importantly, she had done it on her own terms, without sacrificing who she was or what mattered most to her. The journey had been long and difficult, but Evelyn knew that it had been worth every moment. She had found her calling, and now she was ready to step into the role she had always dreamed of, doctor. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the cardiology department as Evelyn Matthews walked through the corridors of her new hospital, the weight of her white coat settling comfortably on her shoulders. The badge clipped to her pocket now bore the title she had worked so hard to earn: Dr. Evelyn Matthews, cardiology resident. The letters seemed surreal, almost as if they belonged to someone else. But they were hers, earned through years of perseverance, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. Evelyn's residency had officially begun, and with it came the challenges and responsibilities she had both anticipated and feared. The hours were long, the work demanding, and the learning curve steep. Yet, despite the intensity of her new role, Evelyn felt an exhilaration she hadn't experienced since her first days in medical school. She was finally where she belonged, doing the work she had always dreamed of. The hospital where Evelyn was completing her residency was one of the most prestigious in the country, known for its cutting-edge research and world-class patient care. The cardiology department, in particular, was renowned for its excellence, attracting some of the best and brightest in the field. Evelyn was honored to be a part of it, but she also knew that this meant the expectations were higher than ever. As a first-year resident, Evelyn was responsible for a range of tasks, from conducting patient assessments and managing treatments to participating in complex procedures under the guidance of senior physicians. The work was grueling, often pushing her to her physical and emotional limits, but Evelyn embraced it with the same determination that had carried her through medical school. She knew that this was the final stretch, the last hurdle before she could fully step into her role as a cardiologist. One of the most challenging aspects of her residency was the sheer volume of patients she was responsible for. The hospital's cardiology unit was always busy, with patients coming in from all over the region for treatment of heart conditions, ranging from common arrhythmias to life-threatening heart attacks. Evelyn quickly learned that there was little time for hesitation. Decisions had to be made swiftly and confidently, and the stakes were often life or death. During her first few weeks, Evelyn found herself working long shifts, sometimes stretching into 24 or even 36 hours. The physical exhaustion was intense, but it was the emotional toll that surprised her the most. Many of the patients she cared for were critically ill, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, not all of them survived. Evelyn had always known that medicine could be heartbreaking, but nothing could have prepared her for the pain of losing a patient she had fought so hard to save. One night, during a particularly grueling shift, Evelyn was called to the emergency department to assist with a patient who had been brought in after collapsing at home. The patient, Mr. Daniels, was a 62-year-old man with a history of coronary artery disease. When Evelyn arrived, the team was already performing CPR, their faces grim with the urgency of the situation. Evelyn quickly took charge, ordering the administration of medications and preparing for the possibility of an emergency intervention. The minutes ticked by in a blur of activity, but despite their best efforts, Mr. Daniels' heart refused to stabilize. After what felt like an eternity, the attending physician looked at Evelyn and shook his head, signaling that it was time to call the code. As the room fell silent, Evelyn felt a deep sense of defeat. She had seen patients die before, but this time was different. She had been the one in charge, the one responsible for making the decisions that might have saved his life. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders, and she struggled to maintain her composure as she stepped out of the room. Later, as she sat alone in the hospital's break room, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Evelyn's mind raced with questions. Had she missed something? Could she have done more? The doubts that had haunted her throughout her journey began to resurface, and for the first time since starting her residency, she wondered if she was truly cut out for this. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard the door open and looked up to see Dr. Patel, one of the senior cardiologists on staff. He was a tall, imposing man with years of experience, known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense approach to medicine. Evelyn had worked with him several times during her residency and respected him deeply, but she also found him intimidating. "Dr. Matthews," Dr. Patel said, his voice softer than usual as he approached her. "I heard about Mr. Daniels." "I'm sorry." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. I feel like I failed him." Dr. Patel took a seat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "Evelyn, every doctor has felt that way at some point. We go into this profession to save lives, and when we can't, it's natural to feel like we've failed. But the truth is, there are limits to what we can do. We're not gods, we're human. We do our best, And sometimes, it's not enough. Evelyn looked down at her hands, the weight of his words sinking in. I just keep thinking that maybe if I had done something differently. Dr. Patel shook his head. Medicine is full of what-ifs, but dwelling on them won't help you or your patients. What's important is that you learn from every experience, even the painful ones. You did everything you could for Mr. Daniels, and sometimes, that's all we can do. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to let go of the guilt that had been gnawing at her. Thank you, Dr. Patel. I'll try to remember that. Dr. Patel offered her a reassuring smile. You're a good doctor, Evelyn. I've seen the way you care for your patients, the way you go above and beyond. Don't let one loss overshadow all the good you're doing. Learn from it, but don't let it define you. Evelyn nodded, feeling a small measure of comfort in his words. The pain of losing Mr. Daniels would stay with her, but she knew that she couldn't let it undermine her confidence. She had to keep moving forward, for herself and for the patients who still needed her. As the weeks turned into months, Evelyn's confidence grew. She continued to face challenges, but each one brought with it valuable lessons that made her a stronger, more capable physician. She learned to trust her instincts, to make decisions with clarity and conviction, and to balance the emotional demands of her work with the need for self-care. But the road was not without its bumps. Despite her growing skills and experience, Evelyn still encountered instances of bias and discrimination, subtle and otherwise. Some colleagues, both senior and junior, seemed to doubt her capabilities, often questioning her decisions more harshly than they did others. The scrutiny was exhausting, and there were moments when Evelyn felt the familiar weight of being judged not just as a doctor, but as a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. One such moment came during a particularly high-stakes procedure. Evelyn had been assisting in a cardiac catheterization, a delicate procedure used to diagnose and treat heart conditions. The patient was a 54-year-old woman with severe coronary artery disease, and the procedure was critical to her treatment plan. As the procedure began, Evelyn worked alongside Dr. Patel, who was leading the team. Everything was going smoothly until they encountered a complication. One of the patient's arteries was severely narrowed, making it difficult to advance the catheter. It was a tense situation, and Evelyn knew that any mistake could have serious consequences. Dr. Patel, who had been guiding the procedure, looked to Evelyn. Dr. Matthews, what do you suggest we do here? Evelyn quickly assessed the situation, considering the options. She had seen this complication before and knew that they needed to proceed with caution. I recommend we switch to a smaller guide wire and use a more flexible catheter to navigate the narrowing. It should give us better control and reduce the risk of causing further damage. Dr. Patel nodded in agreement, but before they could proceed, another attending physician, Dr. Roberts, who had joined them midway through the procedure, interjected. Are you sure about that, Dr. Matthews? This is a tricky situation, and we need to be absolutely certain before making any changes. Evelyn felt a surge of frustration at the implication that she hadn't fully considered her recommendation. She knew what she was doing, and she had been careful in her assessment. But instead of letting her frustration show, she remained calm and confident. I'm confident that this approach will allow us to safely navigate the narrowing and complete the procedure. Dr. Patel glanced at Dr. Roberts, his expression unreadable. I agree with Dr. Matthews. Let's proceed, as she suggested. Evelyn focused on the task at hand, carefully guiding the catheter as they switched to the smaller guide wire. The room was silent, the tension palpable, but Evelyn's hands were steady, her mind clear. After a few moments, they successfully navigated the narrowing, and the procedure continued without further complications. When it was over, Dr. Patel looked at Evelyn with a nod of approval. Well done, Dr. Matthews. Evelyn smiled, feeling a sense of pride and relief. But as she left the operating room, she couldn't shake the lingering frustration with Dr. Roberts's doubt. She knew that, as a resident, her decisions would be questioned. But there was a difference between constructive questioning and undermining someone's confidence. She had felt the difference keenly, and it was a reminder that, even as a doctor, she would still face challenges that went beyond medicine. That evening, As Evelyn reviewed her notes and prepared for the next day, she reflected on the day's events. The doubts, the questioning of her capabilities, those were battles she would continue to fight. But she also knew that she had the skills, the experience, and the resolve to rise above them. She had proven herself time and time again, and she wasn't about to let anyone make her doubt that. As her first year of residency drew to a close, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had come so far, from the days of studying in her small Chicago apartment to standing in the operating room, saving lives. The road had been long and difficult, but it had also been deeply rewarding. One day, as Evelyn was preparing to leave the hospital after a long shift, she received an unexpected visit. Karen, her friend and fellow night owl from medical school, had come to see her. The two women had stayed in touch over the years, but with their busy schedules, it had been difficult to find time to catch up in person. "Karen!" Evelyn exclaimed, pulling her friend into a warm embrace. "It's so good to see you. What brings you here?" Karen smiled, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I had a conference in town, and I couldn't leave without seeing you. I've been hearing great things about your residency, Dr. Matthews." Evelyn laughed, feeling a surge of happiness at seeing her friend. "Oh, you know how it is. Lots of hard work, long hours, and a few moments of sheer terror. But I'm loving it." Karen's expression softened as she looked at Evelyn. "I'm so proud of you, Evie. You've accomplished so much, and you're doing exactly what you were meant to do." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to Karen's words. "Thank you, Karen. I couldn't have done it without you and the rest of the night owls. You all kept me going when things got tough." Karen nodded, her smile warm. "That's what friends are for. And speaking of the night owls, we're planning a reunion. We all miss you, and we think it's time we got together to celebrate how far we've come." Evelyn's heart swelled with affection for her friends. The night owls had been her lifeline during some of the most challenging times of her life, and the thought of seeing them all again filled her with joy. "I'd love that, Karen. Count me in." As the two women sat together, catching up on each other's lives, Evelyn felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had been blessed with a support system that had carried her through the darkest moments, and she knew that she wouldn't be where she was today without the love and encouragement of her friends and family. As Evelyn's residency continued, she continued to grow as a physician. She developed a special interest in heart failure management, inspired by the memory of her father and the patients she had cared for over the years. She found herself drawn to the complex cases, the ones that required not just medical expertise but also empathy, compassion, and a deep understanding of the patient's life and struggles. One day, Evelyn was assigned a new patient, Mrs. Parker, a 70-year-old woman with advanced heart failure. Mrs. Parker had been admitted to the hospital several times over the past year, each time with worsening symptoms. The medical team had tried everything, but her condition continued to decline. When Evelyn first met Mrs. Parker, she was struck by the woman's frailty, but also by the determination in her eyes. Despite her illness, Mrs. Parker was a fighter, and Evelyn knew that she would do everything in her power to help her. As Evelyn reviewed Mrs. Parker's case, she noticed something that had been overlooked in previous assessments. Mrs. Parker had been on a high-sodium diet for years, despite being advised to reduce her salt intake. The issue wasn't that Mrs. Parker was ignoring medical advice, but rather that she lived alone and struggled with cooking for herself. She relied heavily on prepackaged meals, which were often high in sodium. Evelyn decided to take a different approach. She spent time talking with Mrs. Parker, learning about her life, her daily routines, and the challenges she faced in managing her diet. Together, they came up with a plan that included home-cooked meals delivered by a community program and regular check-ins with a dietitian. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Parker's condition began to improve. She still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, she was stable, and her symptoms were under control. Evelyn felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had made a difference in Mrs. Parker's life, not just by treating her illness, but by addressing the underlying issues that had contributed to it. As Evelyn's residency neared its end, she began to think about the future. She had always known that she wanted to specialize in cardiology, but now she was considering pursuing a fellowship in heart failure management. The idea excited her, but it also meant more years of training and more challenges ahead. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Evelyn sat down to write a letter to her father. She had started this tradition years ago, writing to him on special occasions or when she needed guidance. Tonight, she felt the need to share her thoughts with him, to reflect on how far she had come and where she was headed. "Dear Daddy," she began, her pen moving steadily across the page. "I wish you could see me now. I'm in the final stretch of my residency, and I'm doing exactly what I always dreamed of, caring for patients and making a difference in their lives. It hasn't been easy, and there have been times when I've wondered if I was strong enough to keep going. But every time I felt like giving up, I thought of you, of everything you sacrificed for our family, and it gave me the strength to keep moving forward." Evelyn paused, her heart heavy with emotion. "I'm thinking about specializing in heart failure management, Daddy. It's a field that's close to my heart, and I know it's where I can make the biggest impact. I want to help people like you, people who deserve better care and more support. I want to make sure that no one else has to go through what you did." As she finished the letter, Evelyn felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew that her father would be proud of her, that he would have supported her every step of the way, and she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The final stretch of Evelyn's residency was filled with a mixture of excitement and anticipation. She had learned so much, grown so much, and she was eager to take the next step in her career. But she also knew that she would miss the camaraderie of her fellow residents, the mentors who had guided her, and the patients who had touched her heart. On the day of her residency graduation, Evelyn stood on the stage, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had come so far from the days when she first dreamed of becoming a doctor, and now she was about to step into that role fully. As she received her diploma, the room erupted in applause, and Evelyn felt tears of joy fill her eyes. After the ceremony, Evelyn was surrounded by her friends and family, all of them beaming with pride. Jessica and Malcolm were there, along with Karen and the other night owls, who had traveled from all over the country to be there for her. As they celebrated together, Evelyn felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had achieved her dream, and she had done it on her own terms, with the support of the people who mattered most to her. But as she looked around at the faces of her loved ones, Evelyn knew that her journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still lives to be saved, still work to be done, and she was ready for all of it. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of the hospital, casting a warm glow over the bustling cardiology department. Evelyn Matthews stood at the nurse's station, reviewing her schedule for the day. Her name was now listed alongside the attending physicians, a title that still felt surreal despite the years of hard work that had led to this moment. She was officially Dr. Evelyn Matthews, a fully fledged cardiologist specializing in heart failure management. The journey had been long and arduous, but she had finally realized her dream. Evelyn's fellowship had been a challenging yet deeply rewarding experience. The additional years of training had honed her skills and deepened her understanding of the complexities of heart disease. She had worked alongside some of the brightest minds in the field, participated in groundbreaking research, and treated patients whose lives had been hanging by a thread. But through it all, Evelyn had remained focused on her ultimate goal: to bring compassionate, high-quality care to the underserved communities that needed it most. As Evelyn prepared for her rounds, she reflected on how far she had come. The little girl who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor had faced countless obstacles: poverty, discrimination, personal loss. Yet she had persevered, and now she was in a position to make a real difference in the lives of others. The thought filled her with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that went beyond anything she had ever imagined. The first patient on her list was Mrs. Parker, the elderly woman she had treated during her residency. Mrs. Parker had become one of Evelyn's regular patients, and they had developed a close bond over the years. Despite her advanced heart failure, Mrs. Parker had managed to maintain a good quality of life, thanks in large part to the personalized care plan that Evelyn had helped create. Evelyn knocked gently on the door before entering Mrs. Parker's room. The older woman was sitting up in bed, her eyes bright as she greeted Evelyn with a smile. "Good morning, Dr. Matthews," she said, her voice warm. "It's always a pleasure to see you." Evelyn returned the smile, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker. How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Parker sighed softly, her expression contemplative. "I'm feeling okay, all things considered. I have my good days and my bad days, but I'm grateful for every day I get." Evelyn nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "That's a good attitude to have, Mrs. Parker, and we're going to keep working together to make sure you have as many good days as possible." They spent the next few minutes discussing Mrs. Parker's condition, adjusting her medication, and reviewing her care plan. But as they talked, Evelyn noticed that Mrs. Parker seemed quieter than usual, as if something was weighing on her mind. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Parker?" Evelyn asked gently. "You seem a little distracted today." Mrs. Parker hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've been thinking a lot about my life lately, about all the things I've done and the things I haven't. I'm not afraid of dying, Dr. Matthews, but I do worry about what I'll leave behind. I don't have any children, no family to speak of. Sometimes I wonder if I've made any difference at all." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to Mrs. Parker's words. She reached out and took the older woman's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "You've made a difference in my life, Mrs. Parker, and I know you've touched the lives of many others as well. The kindness you've shown, the wisdom you've shared, those are things that will live on long after you're gone." Mrs. Parker's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Evelyn sat with Mrs. Parker for a while longer, offering comfort and companionship. As she left the room, she couldn't help but reflect on the conversation. It was a reminder of the fragility of life and of the importance of making each day count. Evelyn knew that this was the reason she had chosen to become a doctor. Not just to treat illness, but to provide comfort, to offer hope, and to make a difference in the lives of her patients. The rest of the day passed in a blur of consultations, procedures, and patient visits. Evelyn moved through her tasks with a quiet confidence, drawing on the skills and knowledge she had acquired over the years. But despite the demands of her work, she never lost sight of the human side of medicine. She took the time to listen to her patients, to understand their fears and concerns, and to reassure them that they were not alone. As the day came to an end, Evelyn returned to her office to catch up on paperwork. She was reviewing a chart when there was a knock on the door. She looked up to see James, one of her closest friends from medical school, standing in the doorway. "James, what a nice surprise," Evelyn said, smiling as she stood to greet him. James grinned, holding up a bottle of wine. "I thought you might be up for a little celebration. I heard from a very reliable source that today marks your 1-year anniversary as an attending physician." Evelyn laughed, shaking her head in mock disbelief. "Has it really been a year? It feels like just yesterday we were struggling through anatomy lab together." James stepped into the office, placing the bottle of wine on her desk. "Time flies when you're saving lives. But seriously, Evelyn, I'm so proud of you. You've come so far, and you've accomplished so much." Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude as she looked at her friend. "Thank you, James. That means a lot to me, and I couldn't have done it without the support of amazing friends like you." James smiled warmly. "Well, we've been through a lot together, haven't we? But look at us now, 2 doctors doing what we love. I'd say we've done pretty well for ourselves." Evelyn couldn't help but agree. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every sacrifice. She had found her place in the world, and she was doing the work she had always dreamed of. As the evening wore on, Evelyn and James reminisced about their time in medical school, sharing stories of their struggles and triumphs. They talked about the patients who had touched their hearts, the mentors who had guided them, and the moments that had defined their careers. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and of the bonds that had carried them through. Later that night, as Evelyn returned to her apartment, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The challenges had been immense, but so had the rewards. She had faced doubt, discrimination, and personal loss, but she had never given up. She had proven to herself and to the world that anything was possible with determination, perseverance, and a deep belief in oneself. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn took a moment to stand by the window, looking out at the city lights that stretched across the horizon. The future was bright, filled with possibilities, and she knew that her journey was far from over. There were still lives to be saved, still patients who needed her care, and still work to be done. But tonight, as she stood in the quiet of her apartment, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of peace. She had achieved her dream, and she had done it on her own terms. She had become the doctor she had always wanted to be, and she knew that her father would have been proud. With a smile on her face and a heart full of gratitude, Evelyn Matthews climbed into bed, ready to face whatever challenges the next day would bring. She had proven that dreams were not just for the young, that they were for anyone willing to fight for them, no matter how long it took. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that her journey was far from over. It was just the beginning.